Welcome to another episode of the .NET Show. In this special episode, we're coming to you live from PDC05 here at the Los Angeles Convention Center. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the Windows Vista SDK. And if you think about it, what better place to talk about the SDK than the PDC? The PDC's primary reason is to bring you great developer information. And that's the exact same thing the SDK is for. But before we get to that, let's check in with Erica and the news.
Welcome to the MSDN News Update. I'm Erica Wiechers. On September 13th at the Microsoft Professional Developers Conference 2005, Bill Gates unveiled advances in the upcoming Windows Vista and Office 12. Gates underscored how together, Windows Vista and Office 12 will represent a major step forward in terms of what people can do with software and the solutions developers can build. In the first public demonstration of the next version of Office, Gates unveiled how Office 12 will deliver a thoroughly redesigned, results-oriented user interface that enables people to focus on what they want to do rather than how they do it. The new design is based on customer insight gained through the company's extensive and ongoing usability research. For example, the new UI replaces traditional menus and toolbars with a set of highly graphical command tabs that correspond to the task people want to accomplish. Also at PDC05, Microsoft announced the Windows Vista Community Technology Preview Program. The CTP program will involve customers and partners in the early stage of Windows Vista development. The first Windows Vista CTP build was distributed to all PDC attendees and will be available to participants in the Windows Vista Technical Beta program and to MSDN and TechNet subscribers. Microsoft will continue to release CTP builds on a monthly basis throughout the Windows Vista development process, and all feedback will be processed through the MSDN Product Feedback Center. In his PDC05 keynote, Jim Allchin demonstrated a solution for the .NET framework called the Language Integrated Query, or LINQ project, a set of language extensions to the C# and Visual Basic programming languages that extends the Microsoft .NET framework by providing integrated querying for objects, databases, and XML data. Using LINQ, developers will be able to write queries natively in C# or Visual Basic without having to use other languages such as SQL or XQuery. On September 14th, Microsoft introduced Windows Workflow Foundation, a workflow engine, programming model, and set of tools for developers to rapidly build workflow-enabled applications. It consists of a WinFX namespace, an in-process workflow engine, and designers for Visual Studio 2005. Windows Workflow Foundation is available currently in beta for both client and server versions of Windows. And this has been the MSDN News Update. I'm Erica Wiechers.
Welcome back. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about the SDK, specifically the SDK for Windows Vista, and how more of an appropriate place to do that than at the Professional Developers Conference here in Los Angeles in 2005. Joining me on stage, I have Stephen Goulet and Christine Klenke from the SDK team. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So, SDK, I mean, why would someone want to use an SDK? What exactly is it?
Well, the SDK is a collection of a number of things: samples, tools, systems documentation, both the reference kind and the conceptual kind, that really helps developers get started in understanding what they need to do, the concepts, how to build an application, how to structure it, how to start basically from knowing nothing about Windows Vista, the features and functionalities that are there, and go to writing a Hello World application and eventually on to more sophisticated applications.
I mean, I'm not quite sure why I'd want to use the SDK. I mean, I use Visual Studio and all the information I need is right there.
Actually, most of the information you get from the SDK is included in Visual Studio. So you are using the SDK if you're using Visual Studio.
So I mean, so the documentation, the tooltips and stuff like that is actually coming from your team, not the Visual Studio team.
Well, we work very closely with them. It's a very close partnership that we have. Documentation comes from a variety of groups within the company. We pull major pieces of that documentation together, and then we work with the Visual Studio team to have it produced and exposed through Visual Studio.
So do they pay you any royalties for that?
No, but they should.
Okay, yeah. Now, well, I mean, so the SDK is a lot of documentation about developing Windows applications.
It's probably the largest part of the SDK. Yeah.
And so that's not the only part. What else is in the SDK?
No, we also, as Steve mentioned, we have tools. We have build environments, compilers. So the idea is with
Wait, compilers. That's Visual Studio, isn't it?
We ship some too, and we have the C++ compiler in the SDK. So the idea is if you have the SDK and you don't have Visual Studio, you should be able to build an entire Windows application from end to end.
So the Visual Studio team probably wouldn't want me saying this, but I mean, I don't really need to buy Visual Studio if I've got the SDK.
You should be able to get, again, a rudimentary application, a Hello World style application. Obviously, Visual Studio adds a lot of power, flexibility, ease of use.
Visual designers. The SDK is very much notepad based.
So you're a command line tool.
Command line tool.
Exactly.
Yes.
But it's very close to the metal. One of the things that we take a lot of pride in the SDK is that if you really want that experience of really understanding what's going on underneath the covers, so that you know how reference assemblies work and how they're pulled in, it's the tools that are inside the SDK itself that are going to really give you that experience so that you understand all of the inner workings of the platform. So, I mean, and who develops these tools?
Various teams around the company do. We basically, we're an aggregator in that sense. So if teams that are developing tools, they're good SDK tools, we get them, we put them in the SDK. Some of them come from the Visual Studio team or the developer division. Various tools.
Others come directly from Windows. Sometimes it's just a developer in his office who says, I got an idea for this tool that would be neat for developers to use. And they give us a call, and we kind of work with them to say, well, this is what you need to do to have it be an SDK tool. And they go away and talk to their manager about investing the time and energy to make it an SDK-capable tool, and then it gets included. So, I mean, so you got tools, you got documentation, and you also said you got sample code. Lots of sample code. We hear from developers frequently that samples actually in two forms, actually three forms. One being code snippets, just little kind of 2-3 lines of code in the docs.
Embedded in the documentation, so the reference topics and the how-to topics.
Yeah, it really helps them get up to speed because they can see the API, they can see how it's supposed to be used right there. That helps them get up to speed with the technology very quickly. The second form is kind of a sample app, a little bit bigger piece of code, should be fully compilable. You're up into hundreds perhaps of lines of code that show a particular functionality to actually have a full window that opens up, draw a line, draw a shape, whatever the sample is intended to expose, but it's a fully self-contained thing.
Focus on a technology or a feature, typically.
And who develops the sample application?
All the product teams do. We do. We have developers on our staff that develop some of the samples, but we rely, for the most part, on the contributing teams to give us the samples that are really showing how to use their technology the right way. There's a third form of sample, though, that I did want to mention, which is kind of the end-to-end sample, kind of larger application, which is a fully functional application. And we've got a couple of those that we've brought with us at the PDC. Mantis is one of them. It's kind of an asteroids
game. We have it, the SDK available.
Games are great samples.
Yeah. They show people how to do graphics, some of the Windows Presentation Foundation graphic stuff. They show people how to work with the Windows Communication Foundation technology.
It's all WinFX based.
So it's all WinFX based, and it shows how to use that technology in a fun kind of way.
I know, one of the problems we're having, like internally when we're developing applications and demos, even for something like the PDC, is that from build to build, there's various changes, and sometimes the API model, sometimes some of the underlying structure of the entire graphics model or something like that makes some big changes. They decide to change animation or 3D in some fashion. I expect that sort of stuff's really hard for you guys to keep on top of as well, because not only is your documentation changing, but suddenly the sample apps you wrote don't work anymore, or they're just totally showing something that doesn't exist anymore because it's done in a better way.
Yes, documentation, samples, our build environments, it's very easy for them to get out of sync if any product team changes their APIs underneath us. So there's a lot of management involved of tracking what's changing, knowing what changes are coming, communicating those changes so that you stay on top of it a little bit better.
Christine spends probably too much time sometimes making sure that all of those things line up.
Right.
But one of the things about samples that's great is, we've got closing in on thousands of samples in the WinFX SDK. And we use those actually to make sure that things are compatible. We try to make sure that they all compile and all run And when they don't work, we know that something's up, and we use those actually as a kind of check to make sure that things are in sync as well.
Now, do you have any sort of like automated process, or is it all really just, as they say, butts in seats that are just looking at what's happening and trying to figure out the changes?
A lot of it's automated, but we're automating more and more as we go on. We are pulling things from different labs. We're communicating more with the teams that are pulling from. Our samples testing is automated now, so every build that comes out, all of our 700, 800, 900 samples go through a test. We get a list of what's failing and what's not, and so that's helped a lot. So we're working on a lot of that infrastructure.
As Christine said, we do automate what we can, but we're working with how many contributing teams? 40?
50 contributing teams.
So, and they all have slightly different ways of doing things, and we try to accommodate that, but that does involve some manual processing when we do that. So it makes it complicated.
You have trouble with the documentation you have in the SDK getting out of date perhaps, and maybe some of the developers out in the field are going to have sometimes the wrong information in front of them during a short period of time when the builds are changing at that quick a pace.
It's actually one of the innovations we're trying to find to get into the SDK. Traditionally, everyone knows that when RTM happens, documentation keeps moving, APIs are updated with service packs. We've struggled trying to keep all of our documentation up to date. First of all, we have fewer writers and devs creating all the documentation, so they just have struggled getting the bare minimum done by RTM. We want to be able to get to a place where we're continuously providing updated content to people. So it would be through mechanisms that will allow you to download the latest updates to your SDK. So the authoring teams can keep writing, we can keep writing new samples, we can get bug fixes into the SDK, and get those so that customers have the latest and greatest on the machine at all times. So we're investigating our options around that.
Yeah, is there some way you can maybe put some force on the various dev teams and get them to stop making changes so your document stays up to date, or is that kind of
That's our fantasy world, yeah.
That eventually happens in the software lifecycle. We're actually pretty early on in the release of Windows Vista.
Right.
And we're between beta 1 and beta 2. As things get closer to lockdown, at beta 2 timeframe, the APIs freeze, and then
Catch up a little bit.
And we get the opportunity to catch up a little bit. But the audience should be aware that a lot of the APIs that they're seeing at the same time that the writers are.
Right.
As a matter of fact, it's kind of happening as we speak, that the development teams are working with the writers to get them the latest information that they need to go off and write some good docs on the APIs. And from now to beta 2 into RTM, we're going to be incorporating more and more of that. So I want to encourage the audience to stay tuned to the SDK, download the latest copies, because that's just going to get better and better.
It's actually, managed code is so easy to write that our devs can produce a lot more than our writers and editors can document. So,
well, that's great.
Yeah.
I love hearing about the managed code story all the time.
Yeah.
Now, do you guys have any sort of, a community outreach sort of thing? Are you dealing with the audience and the customers you have for the SDK and understanding what their needs are? Are there any lines of communication set up for that?
We're doing a couple different things. One of them is we're engaging really directly with our MVPs right now. So we're talking to them about some of the innovations we're looking at in the SDK, getting some frontline feedback. We're at the PDC, and we have a booth over in the pavilion. We're talking to everybody we can and getting as much information we can. And in fact, if you come talk to us, we'll give you a little flask with the Windows SDK logo on it. So
yeah, I could use one of those.
Right. The SDK team is very active in the news groups. We're out there trying to touch customers as often as we can, get as much information as you can, get feedback. We know some of the big areas we have that we need to fix are search, and some of our feedback mechanisms are still very inconsistent. So there's some corporate efforts going on to get some search improvements into the documentation, into the SDK. But yeah, we also have some Vista community forums that are going on.
Vista community forums were just created. I think they just went live. Windows Vista.
Yes.
Either yesterday or earlier today. Actually, it was yesterday. Which are community forums that are run by people inside the company with areas of expertise for whatever the particular forum is. We have one for the SDK. There's one for the Windows Presentation Foundation, the Windows Communication Foundation, and all the technologies that are in Windows Vista.
Right.
Their own forums for us to go out and talk to customers with. So we're kind of excited about that.
So this is like a discussion forum that if I had a problem with either the SDK or some sort of programming concept with Windows Vista, I could come to that forum and ask a question, and someone on your team or in developer support or something like that would participate in there some fashion?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yes, if we can't solve the problem, we'll do our best to make sure we get it into somebody's hands if it's directly SDK related, about the tools or the technologies, samples. We should be able to handle that. If it's about a specific API that's functionality, that expertise may exist inside of one of the product teams, so we may have to go there for that, but we'll make sure that it gets to the right hands.
We're also tracking a lot of the feedback so that we can figure out how to make the SDK better to avoid having people need to ask questions and send us comments. So.
Yeah, we've got a few initiatives underway. It's actually a sample in the SDK. It's a kind of Windows Presentation Foundation.
Keeps on catching, huh?
Right.
Trying. Based viewer for some of the docs and some of the samples.
Oh, really? So you're actually using our own technology to display the documentation?
No, it's not a fully functional viewer. There's limitations on it, and we can't, call it our production system because it's just a sample app kind of thing. But it gives you an idea of some of the thinking that's gone into where we want to go, how we want to make that presentation, that experience a better one for our user base. And relating back to the forums, that's where we're interested in getting some feedback in terms of what they'd like to see, how they'd like to view their docs, how they'd like to experience their API walk through their voyage of trying to understand what these APIs are like. If we can help them do that, then that's what we want to do.
So, I mean, if in a perfect world, where do you see the SDK as going in the future?
Excellent question. In a perfect world, we would have a dynamically updatable system that basically when a piece of documentation, a sample or a tool, is updated inside of Microsoft, within days or hours even, assuming it's gone through the right checks and balances, we could then update it and stream it out to millions of users' desktops. We could make that update visible so that they know that they've got a new tool, that they know they've got some new documentation, that they know they've got some new samples, and here it is, and they kind of go, wow. Then the customer, we think, would have a much better feeling with their SDK tools, that they're always up to date, that it's accurate, it's never getting out of step with what's in the operating system or any of the underlying runtimes. We want them to have a really good experience in terms of updating that information. We want them to have an excellent experience in terms of navigating and finding it. We want them to be able to type something into the search bar of their Explorer and get exactly the right API. We know that we've got a lot of tools and technologies in our SDKs. It's about 2 gigabytes of documentation that we've got here at various SDKs here at the PDC. And sometimes finding the information you want is a big problem. We call it the button problem inside. You type button into a search window and you get 500 hits, and sometimes the one you're looking for might be 499.
Or 501, which is worse.
So we don't want that to be their experience. We want them to find the information they're looking for really, really quickly, and in a nice kind of pleasurable, easy to navigate kind of experience. So we're working on some portal things as well.
Right, so one of the big things that's happening is we're actually integrating all of our content into one SDK. So one problem we've had is people have said there's 4 or 5 or 6 different SDKs you need if you're going to develop Windows applications. We want to get to one SDK that has everything in it you need to cover Windows. So we're starting that. The PDC version that everyone got has a setup that wraps the Win32 or a native PSDK components with the WinFX components. And going forward, WinFX will be just another feature inside of the Windows SDK. And we want to start partnering better with other SDK teams in the company, so eventually there's just one documentation viewer you go to for all SDK content. You can filter and search, and Steve mentioned find things a lot easier. One place to go to find headers and libs and reference assemblies instead of having to go figure out, okay, where did this SDK install it? I don't know. So we're trying to get away so we're a lot more integrated, we're a lot more consistent, and those are some of the big ticket items we're working on right now. So related to some of those, in the documentation right now, we're integrating content, WinFX and Win32 content. We're creating things like portal directories that allow us to provide pages of links to the high-level things you need to get to. So for example, there's a migration and interoperability portal, there's different portals for all the major technologies inside of Windows. So we're trying to do a lot of integration, a lot of cleanup, and a lot of consistency, because we know they're not very consistent right now. So.
We've got some future ideas as well, kind of out there a ways, so we won't be looking for these in the beta 2 timeframe, but this notion of an API almost having its own blog kind of thing. So people can, from the community perspective, they can go to this API blog and talk about this API and understand it, how it works, and kind of help each other out in grokking the whole thing.
So it's documentation that's not just coming from your team, but it's actually appendix information to documentation that's coming from the community.
Yeah, and it's just additive to the existing stuff that was produced by Microsoft.
Yeah. Okay.
And the contributors the community is a great source of information. They know, they're using this stuff, so they know a lot of the answers to a lot of problems. We'd like to find a way to integrate that into the same, one-stop shopping for the SDK.
Okay. Now, when you're mentioning about the dynamic updating information, having that just happen on the fly, I mean, to a certain extent, that doesn't sound that much different than what a lot of applications are either wanting to do or are actually doing now. Is like, I might start Paint Shop Pro or something like that, and I'll get a dialog box saying, hey, let's go check for updates.
Right.
So what's actually preventing you from actually having dynamic updates today? What are some of the
excellent-
barriers that are in your way?
That's an excellent question. Right now, it's probably not widely known, but our documentation set is huge. It is, I think I compared it to the Encyclopedia Britannica at the last PDC, and we're actually something like 5 times bigger than that in terms of our number of entries in our SDKs.
The SDK is 2/3 of the MSDN content. The SDK documentation makes up 2/3 of all of MSDN's content.
So it's a huge amount of content, and it's packaged in binary formats inside of HXS files and whatnot, so that they can be searched and retrieved and analyzed pretty quickly. But that so that's a good user experience on the desktop. But those files are actually rather large when they're sitting on a server. So if we're trying to download or update those to millions of users' desktops for one little change, that's problematic because you'd be talking about several 100 megabyte updates going out to several 100 million users. So we've got some logistical scaling problems to work out there. We're hoping to change some of the underlying technology to make that easier, and actually use some of the Windows Vista technology to make that easier as well.
Because a lot of the technologies that you're planning on implementing is a big change from the SDK was like way back in the days when I used to work on the SDK team, and then it was just basically more documentation. It's almost more printed documentation than anything else. Back in those days, because we're shipping things on floppy disks, and you don't want to have this gigantic crate of floppies coming at you.
Well, one of the things we want to get to is to ship the documentation as XML. We actually author it in XML, but then we convert it into HTML, and it gets compiled into Havana HXS files. So we lose some of the XML, the benefits of XML on the client. So we want to find a way to get around some of that, push XML directly to the client, allow the client to have a lot more flexibility in how the documentation is viewed, how it's organized.
So what would be some of the benefits you'd get out of staying in your originally XML?
Filtering and search is one of the big ones. So we should be able to, and the other is presentation. I should be able to find my own TOC, define my own TOC, and I should be able to pivot TOCs. And right now our TOC structure is very, very rigid, and it's based on Havana's HXS files. Well, if I just had flat XML files on the system, I could design any sort of portals. I could have portals running on the fly, I could have TOCs on the fly, I could integrate content differently because I wouldn't have a compiled piece anymore. I'd have XML on the fly.
So it's more of a customized documentation.
Right.
One of the problems I have sometimes is just trying to figure out, okay, I know what I'm trying to find, but I have no idea where the SDK team decided that content should live.
Right.
And sometimes I'm constantly having to just recheck and find things, and I just build this big favorites list of, okay, here's the documentation of this stuff, and then something changes and it moves, and it's someplace else. And,
that's kind of a philosophical problem almost, because a lot of different users have different ways that they think about various systems. But I guess there's a couple of things that we're doing to address that. Number one is we're constantly looking at what we're doing from a TOC and organizational standpoint for the default TOCs that we put out there to make sure that they make most sense to most developers. So we're asking them about how things should be organized, laid out. And we also kind of try to make sure they're organized in ways that are consistent with the materials that are being presented here at the PDC. You look at that poster that's there, the WinFX poster, we try to make sure that we map roughly to that layout. The second thing that we're doing is trying to make it a more customizable experience, so you can build your own TOC. I think you mentioned that. So that you can say, well, that's kind of how I think it should be organized and how I think it should be laid out. I'm going to create my own customized view of the world, my own customized TOC, my own customized portal, my own customized presentation. You mentioned the XML on the client. If it's just XML on the client, well, we could send out a new template. You could create your own template for how that information is presented to you, and magically your entire SDK would be presented to you in an entirely different way that's much more customized to your liking. So that's why we want to get to that particular model.
Large corporations have talked to us about being able to integrate their own content or customize the content for them for their own developer world. So that way they can take the content, and right now what they have to do is either copy it or decompile it, or they have to go through a lot of hoops. But this might be something that it would allow them to create their own custom version of the SDK for their world. They could filter what they need to filter, they could view what they need to view. And I have this fantasy feature still that people can save their TOCs and give them to other people. So this is my view of the world, and I could share it with other people. And so people who have the same view you do, you can get one of their TOCs and you've got a new view in the content.
maybe that'd be something they'd stick on their blog.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
I could go to, Anders Heilsberg's blog, and he'd have his view of the world TOC-wise, and I'd know all the things supporting him. Click on one of those links, and it brings up the documentation on my side of the system.
Right.
But that actually brings up another thing that we've been thinking about, is how to incorporate RSS and working with MSDN to make sure that if an API or something like that gets updated, maybe using an RSS mechanism to notify people so that it's there. It's another update mechanism that we're kind of looking at.
We're looking at making the online and offline world a lot more consistent. And offline shouldn't be so out of date. It shouldn't be like, you get benefits of search and some of the compiled features on the offline, but you should get the benefits of online too.
Well, what about like a merging of the two, a blending, so that in my online view, I'm not really have the limitations of a web-based model,
Right.
but it's still a smart client.
That's
I've got
another
all the
one of the-
intelligence going through there, and it's just constantly downloading and caching, and I just happen to go
Yeah,
off.
we've mentioned this tech reviewer we talk about, and it's one of our, we're hoping it's becoming more and more realistic, but it's one of our features that would be based on the XML, and it's that same idea, being able to have, the model is similar to Outlook. So I have an offline viewer, but I have access to online content, and if I'm offline, I have my cached version or my installed version, but if I'm online, I should have the latest of everything, and they should be consistent. There shouldn't be two different ways to do it all.
Yeah.
We're looking into our options around all that as well.
So it sounds like you have an awful lot of work ahead of you.
Yes, it's a challenge, because one of the things we want to do is do some of this innovative work, but at the same time we know that we've got a lot of customers that haven't gotten to the latest stages of working with some of the latest and greatest tools. They've still got to support older code bases, Win 2000, Win 2K, 3, etc. So part of our job is to make sure we're doing some of this innovation, but still supporting those platforms so that those developers that are targeting those older platforms still are productive. and
Now,
have a good
you
working
see
environment.
the ship date of Windows Vista as being a big milestone for you from the standpoint that everything's leading up to that point, and once Windows Vista ships and all the information is basically locked solid, it's not really going to change, might be improved upon, it's not going to really change that much, that your work's going to slow down a bit? Or
Oh, it never slows down. We like to think that it stops at a milestone, but there's always another milestone that's coming up after that, it seems.
We really want to get better at continuous publishing too. Like we know we want to get away from shipping and then forgetting it and moving to the next one. We want to keep providing content and keep supporting those things that are already there.
And we'll still have a lot of work to do. I mean, we're going to have at RTM, our goal is to make sure that the APIs are very well documented. There's 4,500 new Win32 APIs in Windows Vista, spanning lots of features and functionality, from security, manageability, reliability. There's a new instrumentation framework for performance monitoring for the event tracing subsystems in Windows. There's lots of new APIs there. And when we do the first version, like I said, we're going to do our best to make sure that we've got them all very well documented. But we know that there's going to be kind of a second pass at this, or even a third pass at this, if you will, where we beef it up, get it even to better shape, add a third or fourth paragraph to each API's description, add some more conceptual documentation so that it's easier for people to understand. So once we hit that RTM, again, hopefully we're in this continuous publishing mode. A month later, 2 months later, we've got this update that just adds to a much better experience for our end user customers.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, I think we've probably given the audience a pretty good idea of the issues that the SDK team is always struggling with, as well as the assistance they're always giving them, whether they know it or not, through Visual Studio, through the MSDN, or through the SDK directly. Now, I know after a short break, we're going to take and actually see the SDK in practice and some of the tools.
Parts of the SDK, parts of the tools, parts of the various moving parts.
Okay, thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks.
So hopefully you got a great idea about the Windows SDK is to help you in your development efforts for Windows Vista today and beyond. Now, after this short break, we're going to come back and take a look at the SDK and see specifically what sort of tools and samples and capabilities it has for you. So stay tuned.
do you think of Vista?
This is beautiful. This is absolutely wonderful.
It creates a synergy. It creates an entirely new class of applications.
Ajax, I'm very excited about that. They showed that in the keynote, the Atlas technology.
And what's been your favorite session so far?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Don Box, so I'll go to any of the Indigo things.
Palm 210, the Paul Andrew one.
And did you get a chance to see the expression suite?
Yes, I did. Yes, very nice. I don't have to take a Photoshop file anymore and cut it up. You know, I can leave that to the designer, so no more pixel pushing.
Expression Suite. I, as a developer, am like tickled pink, and I'm excited so much about it.
Not every developer wants to be locked in a corner and just write code. Some of us want to do the visual aspects of it as well.
It's going to revolutionize every way that I build an application. It's going to make things 10 times faster.
What do you think about workflow?
Oh, I'm very excited about it.
A few minutes ago, I was in the session about Windows Workflow Foundation, and it's really impressive.
Unbelievable.
So I just caught you grabbing some swag. Are you picking up some cool stuff?
Got a foldable Microsoft keyboard from MSDN. As long as I'm going through here learning stuff, I'm picking up stuff to bring back to the guys at work. I'll throw it all on the table and say, go for it. I don't know what that is, but it's colorful. My coworkers, that's really, I think, the only reason I got to come was so that they would get all the fun toys.
Welcome back. Now we're going to take a deep dive into the SDK and actually show you some of the capabilities and wonderful features that they built into it. Joining me again is Stephen Goulet, but we've also got Brent Rector here to actually show us the SDK and some of the cool features he's added. Welcome, glad that you could join us.
Thank you.
So, now I understand that, Stephen, we were talking in the break there, and we kind of forgot a couple things. You want to get across?
Actually, two things I wanted to bring to the attention of our developer audience. I mentioned in the previous segment that there's about 4,500 new to Windows Vista, Win32 APIs and COM interfaces. To make the navigation and understanding experience better for the developer, we've created a spreadsheet that Melinda Klein and Barry Butterclay on my team have created that lists all 4,500 of those APIs, the header files that they're in, some information about them, how to link them into your application, how to basically work with each and every one of those APIs. And that spreadsheet's going to be published onto MSDN first, and then it'll be included into our SDK shortly thereafter. And there's also another piece of documentation that we're working on that will be released in stages from PDC to Beta 2. It's about 300 pages of conceptual documentation, all the features of Windows Vista. It's a very developer-oriented document that Melinda Klein on my team has been working and pulling together from all of the different feature teams. We'll release that in stages. It's about 300 pages of documentation that tell you how to use the feature, how to think about the feature from a developer standpoint, and guide you right to the APIs that you should be using to actually implement that feature. We're pretty excited about that.
Great. Obviously important information. I'm glad we're able to get that section there. Okay. So now, Brent, what exactly are you doing with the SDK?
Well, mostly I get tools into the SDK and out to customers. So if there's a tool that should be useful to developer, whether it's developed internally by a product team or by just a dev for his or her own use, I'll try and make that into something that we can put into the SDK and ship to the developers. We've been both doing that in the binary form, and some of our tools we're shipping the source code to as well now. So if it's a developer tool, I want it in the SDK. I came from the outside being a developer for too many decades to mention, and so VI I'd be happy with. Visual C# Express I'd be happy with. People can download that. But for the SDK, we've added quite a few new tools with the latest betas of the SDK, some of which I'd like to show to you today.
Sure, let's take a look at some of those.
Okay, I have the menu open here on a Vista system on my laptop. And notice we have the Microsoft Windows SDK menu item. Right now, the Microsoft Windows SDK is a combination of the Platform SDK and the WinFX SDK. So you'll find all functionality from both SDKs here. The interesting thing here is the build environment window. You can build applications targeting Longhorn unmanaged code. You can build applications targeting managed code. The SDK supports both. Now, one of the things I've already opened here is a command shell. This is the new Microsoft command shell. We used to ship cmd.exe and have for many, many years. So this is our first new command shell in a long time. Let me show you just some of the capabilities of it. It's very akin to command shells on other platforms that have been around decades. You can run command scripts that are powerful. Let's look at one command, get location. Get location returns you the current location in the current provider. Now currently I'm using the file system provider, so it's showing me where I'm at there. But I can CD into a, say, H key LM. What I'll do is I will make a directory, although really I'm just making a new location in the current location. So I'll make something called foo. So now it's created a registry key, H key local machine software Microsoft foo. And if we bring up regedit, which I have running here in the background, and I refresh the view, we will see that the foo registry key has appeared there. I could create properties and subkeys using the shell as well. I can take the key back away, refresh the view, foo goes away. The command shell treats the file system, the registry. There's actually quite a lot of places which are called providers. So notice I can CD into the environment as well, env : and then do a dir, and I get all the items that are in the environment. So the file system, the registry, the environment. I'm working on a provider that lets you change into an assembly and get all the types, and then change into a type and get all the members and nested types.
Okay, now this seems kind of familiar to me. This looks almost like the monad stuff.
Well, this is monad. The Microsoft command shell was aka the software previously known as monad.
So developers getting SDK are now going to get monad.
Monad comes with the WinFX SDK, and in the future will come with the Windows SDK as well.
Okay, so that's how, I mean, I would get the SDK just to get a hold of the monad shell for myself, because I remember we had the show a while back talking about monad,
right,
and I remember how fabulous it was then, and now that I can see I can actually get a hold of it, I mean that's a great tool.
We think it's going to be a pretty powerful tool to developers. Whenever I'm working with any tool, even when I've got Visual Studio and it's my primary environment, I still have a command shell open. This is a very powerful developer-oriented tool for doing
One
these kinds
last
of
thing
functions.
I'd like to show with monad, to give you an idea, it's not really your grandfather's or my command shell from the original days. Let's do a command called get process, which basically returns a list of all the processes on the machine. So let me start up a process. Good old task manager, of course, hides in the foreground here to keep me from seeing everything. So get process, and I say I want task manager. So now we get the line of text it looks like for that thing, but it's really a .NET object. Monad doesn't pipe text around, it pipes objects. So if I say get process task manager, and I pipe it to get members. Oops. Obviously typed the wrong thing here. Let's get back. Task manager. Pipe it to get members. I have to pipe the object, so the return value of that call.
Intellect character 35.
I know, and this worked perfectly in my practice, like it always does. But what we can do is I'll just show you invoking it, get process task manager. If I could type. And then I want to invoke a particular member on it, kill. And a task manager window went away because that's actually an object. It's just not a line of text here. These are all objects. So I could start, stop, kill, process, change the priority of them as well.
That's powerful. Great.
Another thing that people do a lot in the past, because we supported it in .NET 1.1 and 1.0, is XML serialization. If you're ever going to read or write XML, you'll typically write some code similar to XML test. Well, here I create a person object, the person owns a pet, I initialize it, and then by creating an XML serializer, I can just write it out into an XML file. Now, and here I actually create another, open the file and deserialize it back. So here I round trip saving an object to XML and loading it back up. What's not obvious from this particular code sample, and developers have a lot of this kind of code, is that actually those two lines, this XML serializer, new XML serializer, and the second new XML serializer, look for 4 assemblies that aren't found. So you get runtime exceptions trying to find 4 DLLs that don't exist. It does 2 in-memory compiles, and then it loads those 2 assemblies. So if you're trying to have a high perf application, XML serializer used this way is maybe not quite the best way to do it. One way that you can see this kind of thing is, let's actually run this application. Because we catch these exceptions, you don't normally notice that there's all this overhead. But there's a utility called Fusion Log Viewer that if you bring it up, it'll actually show you all the failed XML or assembly load events. And if you bring up one of these, you can actually see why it failed, where it looked, what assembly it was trying to find. So what's interesting in this particular example is I have 4 load failures from that application. We have a new tool called Serialization Assembly Generator in .NET with .NET 2.0, where you can give it the name of an assembly and tell it to generate the assembly that we would normally compile at runtime for you. So notice in all this verbose output here, we've created a new assembly, person.xmlserializers.dll. We can then create the other one that I use in this example.
And keep the files there as well.
And keep the files there, and I'll show you why I kept them. Normally you wouldn't do that, but there's a win for doing that as well. Now if we look, we have a couple of extra assemblies, person.xmlserializers.dll, person.xml, pet.xml serializers. If I run the test again, it's much quicker, even noticeably quicker at the command prompt here. But here, rather than failing to load 4 assemblies, doing 2 in-memory compiles and then 2 successful loads, we just did 2 successful loads. Now, you noticed I said /keep when I generated those files. That kept those files by those very weird file names. So let's look at that D9 CS file. This is the source code for that serialization assembly. What that tool really did is it generated a class that knows how to parse my XML document and put the data into instances of the person class, and vice versa, take a person class and write the data out. So if I had, for some reason, some very strange XML document, it didn't really obey a schema, there was too much ad hoc, this is here if that field's set, I couldn't have a standard serializer generated from a schema. But I could generate one this way and edit the serializer, build it into my app, and now I can deserialize pretty much any XML, valid XML, into a .NET class. So this is a new tool, SGen, the Serialization Assembly Generator, that we didn't have in .NET 1.1. So that's new to Whidbey as well. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so I'll start XAMLpad up here. XAMLpad is this nice application to let you type in XAML and immediately see what you get. So by default, you don't get a very interesting display. There's just a page with a grid with nothing on it. We could put in...
Looks kind of blank to me.
Well, that's why it's nothing interesting.
Okay.
Let's change that. Let's put a button on this page, and we will put my name in the button. And then we'll close out the button tag. And there we go. As soon as I do this, I have a button that I can press. It stretches it to fill the whole page. Not very interesting, but I have some other XAML that's a little bit more interesting. So let me replace this. This is the XAML up in this file. Copy. Select all of this. paste in the new one, give it a second. And so now I have this interesting 3D shape that's rotating with some Avalon animation. So if we just briefly scroll through, because there's quite a bit of stuff here. There's a diffuse brush that's painting a button via a visual brush onto a 3D shape that's defined with that geometry. There's some transforms to rotate it in the various directions, and there's some animations to cause the rotation. But if I look at that, it doesn't seem to be maybe as smooth as I think it should be. But I don't know why. So we have a new tool, it's brand new with this release of the SDK, called Perforator. I had no backing into the name of that, although I do think it's kind of nice. So Perforator is an Avalon performance analysis tool. It takes a little bit to initialize, and you have to look at the online help in the docs, because there's a registry key you have to set to have the data collected. But Perforator will tell you things like how many frames per second you're getting rendering from Avalon. So notice Perforator has come up here. We'll minimize the command window. My animation's still rolling. These are a list of all Avalon-based tasks that are running in the system. If I pick XAML pad, now we have a bunch of options that I can highlight. Notice right now we're getting about 39 to 45 frames per second animation. We're taking about 13 megabytes of video RAM to do it. We're getting a dirty rectangle addition rate of about 88 per interval. But let me check this one, draw software rendering with purple tint. The minute you do this, you cause Avalon to highlight anything that it's using software to render as opposed to the video card hardware with this purple highlighting. So this entire cube that's rotating is being drawn in software, not by hardware. Now I just
by hardware, I mean it's not being drawn by the GPU.
It's not being drawn by the GPU.
Which is
Avalon
the main thing that Avalon is
softwares.
trying to take advantage of.
That's right. Now it turns out one of the key things that's causing this particular sample to software render is this tile mode. I'm trying to tile my visual brush across the surface, even though I only have one copy of it. So since I don't really need to tile it, let's change the tile mode to none. Now notice the purple highlight went away. In fact, there is no purple highlight anywhere now. So now I'm using all hardware rendering, using the GPU on the video card to do the rendering of this particular object. Now we're getting around 53, 58 frames per second. A lot more dirty rectangles. We'll be able to animate more smoothly, do more updates per frame. We're not really using any more video memory. So it's interesting things that you can see here. For example, another option, clear the back buffer before rendering. This effectively causes you to erase the entire screen before every redraw. So you can see how much and where it's trying to redraw the rectangle. Dirty region update overlay. If we turn this on, this is cycling through a color palette to tell you these are the dirty regions that we have to redraw. So pink and then yellow and then blue, and we're doing it so fast that they're all sort of blending together. But in a more static app, you would see which areas have to be redrawn here. So one last app, the sample viewer.
While Brent's loading that up, I think one of the things that's very cool about XAML is its ability for you to just kind of play, to see the different Avalon shapes, sizes, formats, capabilities, different tags, very dynamically. You're just in that editor changing things, and it's immediately being visualized for you. It's a pretty great learning experience in terms of how to work with Avalon tags and all the XAML.
Here's an Avalon sample that's shipped in the SDK. We give you the source code. Notice the nice click on a sample, view the XAML, see it run XAML pad style. And again, Perforator, if we refresh the list, sees the sample viewer there. You can clear the back buffer before rendering, show dirty region updates, all the nice features that we had before. So that's just a quick preview of some of the samples and some of the tools that are in the new WinFX SDK and the Windows SDK.
So, I mean, it sounds like you guys have been really busy with not only the documentation that we're all familiar with in the SDK, but also some of these great tools, samples, and so forth to help you understand better how to develop Avalon applications, WinFX applications, or basically Windows Vista applications moving forward. Now, let's say I'm a developer out there and maybe I don't think I'm currently using the SDK and I want to get a copy of it. How exactly do I get a copy of the SDK?
Well, actually, the primary site is the MSDN Windows Vista Developer Center. That's where we'll be posting all of our SDK materials as a kind of centralized portal page for everybody to go to get everything that they need SDK related.
Mm-hmm. And is that like a free download?
That's a free download. The WinFX SDK itself or the Windows SDK combo with the Win32 pieces. We will have them fully integrated in the beta 2 timeframe, but right now they're available as separate downloads.
And so even like with the new Visual Studio Express capabilities, the applications are coming out with Visual Studio Express, low-cost versions of the compiler and stuff like that. If I'm a hobbyist developer and I want to do things with Windows Vista, I can get a hold of a copy of Visual Studio Express, which is going to include the entire SDK?
Well, they don't actually include it. You would download them separately, but they do work together. We make sure that our documentation and our tools and the various paths and directories that we have in our SDKs plug into the Visual Studio Express SKUs so that, yes, you can build a Windows Vista app or a WinFX app with the Express SKUs.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for joining us. I appreciate understanding more about the SDK and see some of the great tools, and I'm extremely happy that Monad has made it into the SDK. I mean, I can't think of a better place for it to be at, because as a developer, I know that a tool like that I would find extremely useful, and so that's the right place for it to be settling down at.
I use that as my primary shell all the time, as you can see from this demo. Yeah. I love Monad. So.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, hopefully that gave you some insights as to what the SDK is. And hopefully through the other presentations you've been seeing here at the PDC, if you were one of the people that happened to come and join us, you got some great information about why you want to take and develop a Windows Vista application, and now you know the exact tool you need in order to help you develop that much better. Thanks for joining us.
With me today is Steve Cellini of the Platform Evangelism team. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So why don't you start by talking about what the Platform Evangelism team does and what your role in that team is?
Sure. We effectively talk to developers. That's what we do, because we're all technical or ex-developers in one way or another. We feel like we are able to talk their language, communicate with them effectively, understand their problems, understand and take ideas that the product team has about where they think the platform should go, translate it in such a way that we can talk to developers outside the company, get their feedback, push it back. So we think that we can effectively engage with that community, and both at the one-on-one level, developer to developer, company to company, partner to partner, but also at a broad community level as well. So at events like the PDC, for instance, would count as a broad community effort in that regard. So at a general level, that's what the team does.
Okay. And now you mentioned PDC, and so your team is responsible for putting on PDC05.
The team at large is responsible. It's a huge volunteer effort, hundreds of people from all over the place. So, there are folks on the team who take lead roles, but it's definitely a group effort, and they work with folks from all over the place to pull together various efforts like the hands-on labs, or this room, or parts of this room, or the breakout sessions, lunch sessions, Ask the Experts, Birds of a Feather, all those things. So it's a huge effort, but it is run out of the evangelism team.
Can you give us a sense of what it takes to put on a conference of this size? I imagine you were planning this a year or more ago.
Yeah. I think 2,500 pounds of bananas says it right at one level. I mean, it's tremendous logistical efforts involved. Microsoft has a whole logistics team, and we pull those in. We've been working with them for more than a year, effectively since the last PDC. Mm-hmm. And they make sure those guys are professionals. They know how to put on something this big, and then we work with them, at a fairly detailed level, actually, about what it's like to talk to developers. Given a week, what would you do with developers? And so they understand that. Over the last couple of conferences, we really evolved what it means to put on a developer-oriented conference. And it does involve the kind of food, but obviously it goes beyond that, talks about the kinds of breakouts. At the PDC, we really feature very deep intense breakout sessions. So Jeremy Madison, the content owner for this PDC, has spent a lot of time really custom tailoring that for developers. And then the community efforts, Jeff Sandquist on the community side with Channel 9, offline and online community that you see at the show. It's all been in works for a year, and it's somewhat, I think what we try to do with the PDC, which is maybe a little bit unique, but I'm not sure, is we really try to coordinate all these things across the logistics, the business side, community, content, all those things. And hopefully it shows that these things somehow, work together.
Is there something that you are particularly proud of that just went really smoothly?
You want everything to go smoothly, but this room was a big part of the things that we do differently this time. We're in the big room at the PDC, and everything is here. If you're not in a breakout session, we want you to hang out here at the track lounges, the community lounges, the hands-on labs. The SDX will be here tomorrow night. The product pavilion, where Microsoft folks are talking about current products. The track lounges, where people are talking about the future products. You can eat your meals here. We have the Vista test drive area, 100 machines running Windows Vista 5219. Everything is here. So, this is where you're going to connect with Microsoft people and other attendees. And this is kind of an experiment. We haven't really done this before. So this is really, people come to the PC for the content in the end and the community. But this room is a way where we're trying to experiment around the edges and make that experience better.
I think it's really successful. It's fun.
Thank you. And you're enjoying it, I hope, with
it's very
camera
fun.
shots here.
So what are some things you like to do outside of work? What do you do for fun?
Well, lately, fun has been PDC. It's PDC all the time. Everyone involved in the PDC, it's not their day job. So lately it hasn't been too much outside time. But I have a family of 2 kids and love watching those guys grow up, 2 boys, and sort of reliving their childhood, my childhood, vicariously with them. And I like to read. I love reading history and fiction. We shared with my 7-year-old reading the latest Harry Potter. That was fun.
Okay. Did you stand in line for days to get it?
We didn't stand in line, but the next best thing you can do with a 7-year-old, and that was a lot of fun. So sharing that experience, and I like reading business and sort of business history, business type stuff. So reading The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman, recent book, and it's very interesting and very much appropriate for anyone in the technology field, anyone working at Microsoft, anyone at all who sort of has been through the internet bubble and watched the last 10 years, 5 years should read that book.
Right.
When I find the time, I love reading. I think that's the simplest, where there's time.
And how long have you been at Microsoft?
Just over 7 years.
Okay.
I joined as a technical program manager in the SQL team, working on a previous incarnation of WinFX. Before that, I worked in the industry in a string of startups that failed. No one remembers the name to them, which prepared me for Microsoft in a way. Microsoft is constant change. It's a large ecosystem with its own little startups, which is great. But there's a continuity to the place, and it kind of pulls it together. It's really neat.
Okay. And so what are some things you'd like to accomplish this year on your team? Are you starting to plan the next PDC already? Don't want to go that far?
Very funny. We will start planning the next PDC very soon. The first thing we'll do is take everything we learned from here while it's still in our heads, and we'll write down what went well, what didn't go well. It's important to do that soon with the people who are directly involved. Write that down. And the PDC doesn't happen every year, as you know. It happens when we have news. So next one maybe a year from now, maybe 2 years from now. We'll see. For the evangelism team, my team right now will be starting to focus on Windows Vista. We the team is currently seeing the launch, helping with the launch efforts of Visual Studio 2005, and we will start paying attention to Windows Vista. This PDC is a big part of that. So for the next year and a half or so, as we see Vista through launch, and then launch plus 90, launch plus 180 days, we'll see our partners through those process. So we are working right now very closely one-on-one with Windows Vista early adopters. You saw some of them on stage in the keynotes on Monday. And we'll be doing everything we can to work with those partners to drive feedback into the product teams and create lots of evidence so that when Windows Vista launches, people can see what a great platform it is for ISVs and enterprises to build on.
Okay, well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're really busy.
It was enjoyable.
We appreciate it.
Great time, great opportunity to sit down and talk to you.
Relax for a bit.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of the .NET Show.
And stay tuned for the next episode on Visual Studio Team System.
And until then, we'll see you on the web.